The morning sun cast long shadows across the military shooting range as Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez watched a beaten-up pickup truck pull into the parking area. Dust clouds followed the vehicle like a tired sigh, and when it finally stopped, an elderly man stepped out slowly. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone who had learned to respect his body's limitations over many years. The old man wore faded jeans and a simple flannel shirt that had seen better days. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his weathered face told stories of decades spent outdoors. But what caught everyone's attention was the rifle case he pulled from the truck bed. It was an old, scratched case that looked like it had traveled thousands of miles. "Look what the cat dragged in," whispered Private Johnson to his buddy, trying not to laugh. The shooting range was usually reserved for active military personnel and serious competitive shooters. Seeing this grandfather figure walking toward the range office seemed almost comical. The old man's name was Frank Morrison, though nobody knew that yet. He approached the range officer's desk with quiet confidence, his boots making soft sounds on the concrete floor. The young corporal behind the desk looked up from his paperwork, clearly surprised to see a civilian of Frank's age. "Can I help you, sir?" the corporal asked, trying to maintain professional courtesy, while obviously wondering what this old-timer wanted. Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out a range membership card that was so worn the plastic was nearly white. "I'd like to use lane 15, if it's available," he said in a voice that was calm but carried an undertone of authority that the corporal couldn't quite place. The corporal examined the card, checking the computer system. "This membership is from 1987, sir. Are you sure it's still valid?" "Lifetime membership," Frank replied simply. "Earned it during my service years." Around the range office, several young rangers had gathered to witness this unusual scene. They were all in their 20s and 30s, muscles built from intense training, confidence radiating from every movement. These were America's elite soldiers, and they knew it. To them, Frank looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered into the wrong place. "Maybe he's lost," one of them whispered, earning quiet chuckles from his companions. The corporal finished checking the computer and handed Frank a safety briefing sheet. "You'll need to review this, sir, and I'll need to see your weapon for inspection." Frank accepted the paperwork and walked to a nearby bench. As he opened his rifle case, the rangers moved closer, curious to see what kind of hunting rifle this old man brought to a military precision shooting range. When Frank lifted the rifle from its case, conversation stopped. It wasn't a hunting rifle at all. It was a custom sniper rifle, painted in an unusual blue color that seemed to shimmer slightly under the range lights. The weapon was clearly old, but it had been maintained with the kind of care that spoke of deep respect and understanding. "What in the world is that thing?" Private Johnson asked, no longer bothering to whisper. The rifle was unlike anything the young soldiers had seen. Its design was clearly from an earlier era, yet something about its construction suggested it was far more sophisticated than its age might indicate. The blue finish was unique, almost artistic, but the scope mounted on top was serious business. Military-grade optics that probably cost more than most people's cars. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his curiosity overcoming his initial amusement. As a sniper instructor, he knew quality equipment when he saw it, regardless of its age or unusual appearance. "That's an interesting weapon, sir," Rodriguez said, maintaining respect despite his skepticism. "What's the effective range on something like that?" Frank looked up from his safety paperwork, his eyes meeting the sergeant's. For just a moment, something flickered in those older eyes. Not arrogance, not boasting, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he and his equipment were capable of. "Depends on conditions," Frank replied, his voice still calm. "But she's never let me down when it mattered." The rangers exchanged glances. This old man was talking like he actually knew how to use that antique. It seemed impossible. Modern military snipers trained for years to achieve precision at extreme distances, using the latest technology and techniques. How could someone with such an outdated weapon claim any real capability? "Where did you serve, sir?" Rodriguez asked, partly out of curiosity and partly hoping to understand why this civilian was so comfortable around military personnel. "Here and there," Frank answered, not rudely but clearly not interested in sharing details. He finished reviewing the safety briefing and stood up. "Lane 15 still available?" The corporal nodded, still processing what he was seeing. Frank gathered his equipment and headed toward the shooting positions, leaving behind a group of very puzzled young soldiers. As Frank walked away, the Rangers began to whisper among themselves. Some thought he was probably just an old veteran trying to relive his glory days. Others wondered if he might actually know what he was doing. A few were already planning to watch his shooting session for entertainment value. What none of them realized was that Frank Morrison had spent 30 years as one of the military's most elite long-range specialists. His rifle, despite its unusual appearance, represented decades of custom modifications and personal refinements. The blue color wasn't just aesthetic. It was a special coating that reduced glare and provided superior protection against the elements. Frank reached lane 15 and began setting up his equipment with practiced efficiency. His movements were economical, purposeful, showing muscle memory developed over thousands of hours of training and real-world application. But to the watching Rangers, he just looked like an old man playing with an oversized toy. The range stretched out before him, marked targets visible at various distances. Frank knew that these young soldiers were probably expecting him to struggle with targets at normal distances. They had no idea that he was already calculating wind speed, humidity, and atmospheric pressure for shots that would challenge the limits of what they believed possible. As he loaded his first round and settled into position, Frank allowed himself a small smile. Youth always assumed that age meant diminished capability. Today, they were about to learn that experience and knowledge could overcome many limitations that technology alone could not address. Frank Morrison settled into his shooting position with the fluid motion of someone who had done this thousands of times before. His body naturally found the correct stance. His breathing automatically regulated to the steady rhythm that all precision shooters must master. The blue rifle felt familiar in his hands, like greeting an old friend after a long separation. Behind him, the Rangers had gathered at a safe distance, some pretending to work on their own equipment while others made no effort to hide their curiosity. They watched as Frank adjusted his scope with small, precise movements, his weathered fingers working with surprising delicacy. $10 says he can't even hit the 500-yard target, whispered Private Martinez to his squad. Mate, you're on, replied Corporal Stevens. But look at how he's handling that rifle. My grandfather was in Vietnam, and he moves his tools the same way. Sergeant Rodriguez found himself genuinely interested despite his initial skepticism. As a sniper instructor, he had seen hundreds of shooters attempt long-range precision work. Most beginners, regardless of age, showed nervous energy, overthinking every adjustment. Frank, however, moved with calm certainty that suggested real experience. The old man's first target was set at 800 yards, a distance that challenged even experienced military marksmen. Frank spent several minutes studying the wind flags positioned along the range, watching how they moved in the morning air. His eyes tracked the heat shimmer rising from the ground, calculating how atmospheric conditions would affect his bullet's path. The Rangers grew impatient. They were accustomed to quick shots, rapid engagement, and immediate results. This methodical preparation seemed excessive for what they assumed would be a mediocre performance at best. Is he going to shoot, or just stare at it all day? Johnson muttered, earning quiet laughs from his companions. Frank's preparation continued for another few minutes. He checked his rifle's position 3 times, made microscopic adjustments to his scope, and even pulled out a small notebook to jot down atmospheric readings. To the watching soldiers, it seemed like overthinking. In reality, Frank was applying decades of knowledge about external ballistics, environmental factors, and equipment limitations. Finally, Frank settled into his final shooting position. His left hand supported the rifle's forestock with rock-steady firmness, while his right hand gripped the stock with just enough pressure to maintain control without inducing tremor. His cheek found its natural place against the stock, bringing his dominant eye into perfect alignment with the scope. The range fell quiet. Even the skeptical Rangers found themselves holding their breath as Frank's finger moved to the trigger. Through his scope, the 800-yard target appeared clear and steady. Frank's breathing slowed to nearly imperceptible movements. His heart rate controlled through years of training. The shot came as a surprise, even to Frank. That was the mark of proper trigger control. The conscious mind should never anticipate the exact moment of firing. The blue rifle's report echoed across the range, a sharp crack that spoke of precision engineering and careful load development. Downrange, the target showed the unmistakable mark of a perfect center hit. No way, breathed Martinez. pulling out binoculars to confirm what they had all seen. The bullet hole was dead center in the target's bullseye, placed with the kind of precision that military snipers spent months trying to achieve consistently. Rodriguez felt his assumptions shifting. That shot wasn't luck. The preparation time, the methodical approach, the steady execution. This old man clearly knew exactly what he was doing. Frank worked the bolt of his rifle smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. He made no comment about his successful shot, showing neither surprise nor satisfaction. To him, hitting an 800-yard target was simply expected performance, nothing worth celebrating. Maybe that was just a lucky shot, Stevens said, though his voice lacked conviction, as if he had heard the comment Frank fired again. The second bullet joined the first in the target's center, creating a group so tight that the two holes nearly touched. The Rangers stared in disbelief. Frank continued shooting, placing 5 rounds total into the 800-yard target. When the ceasefire was called and targets were checked, his group measured less than 3 inches, performance that would be exceptional even for the range's most experienced military snipers. The young soldiers looked at each other with growing confusion. Everything they thought they knew about this situation was proving wrong. The old man with the strange blue rifle was demonstrating shooting skills that surpassed most of their own capabilities. Okay, that's actually pretty impressive, Rodriguez admitted, approaching Frank's position. What's your background, sir? That's some serious marksmanship. Frank was cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he had shown in shooting it. Just practice, he said simply, not looking up from his work. Rodriguez wasn't satisfied with that answer. Sir, with respect, that's not just practice. That's professional-level precision shooting. Most of my students would be thrilled to shoot half that well at 800 yards. Frank finally looked up, meeting the sergeant's eyes. Your students are probably very capable, he said diplomatically. They just haven't been doing it as long as I have. The understatement was almost comical. Frank had been shooting precision rifles since before most of these Rangers were born. His first military sniper training had taken place when their parents were still in high school. But he saw no reason to elaborate on his background unless specifically asked. Martinez approached with obvious curiosity. Sir, that rifle of yours, what caliber is it? The sound is different from our 308s. Custom round, Frank replied, still focused on his cleaning routine. Developed it myself over the years. This information created more questions than answers. Developing custom ammunition required extensive knowledge of ballistics, metallurgy, and precision reloading techniques. It was the kind of expertise that took decades to develop and suggested a much deeper involvement in long-range shooting than casual hobby work. Stevens studied the blue rifle with new respect. That finish is unusual. Is it functional or just aesthetic? Functional, Frank answered. Reduces glare, protects against corrosion, and helps with thermal regulation. Had it applied by a friend who works in aerospace coatings. The Rangers exchanged glances. This wasn't some grandfather's hunting rifle painted blue for looks. This was a serious precision instrument, modified and maintained by someone with extensive technical knowledge and significant resources. Rodriguez made a decision. Sir, would you be interested in trying some longer distances? We have targets set up to 1 and 200 yards, and I'd be curious to see how your equipment performs. Frank paused in his cleaning routine, considering the invitation. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Far's 200 yards might be interesting, he said quietly. None of the Rangers realized they had just witnessed Frank's warm-up session. The real demonstration was yet to come. Word spread quickly through the range about the old man's impressive shooting at 800 yards. What had started as a small group of curious Rangers soon grew into a larger gathering, as off-duty personnel arrived to witness what was becoming an unexpected demonstration of marksmanship. Major Patterson, the range commander, appeared from his office after hearing reports about the unusual situation. A veteran of multiple combat deployments, Patterson had seen plenty of exceptional shooters throughout his career. He approached Frank's position with professional interest and healthy skepticism. I understand you've been putting on quite a show, Patterson said, extending his hand to Frank. I'm Major Patterson, range commander. Frank stood and shook the offered hand firmly. Frank Morrison, sir. Just doing some practice shooting. Patterson's experienced eyes took in Frank's equipment and setup. The blue rifle was unlike anything in the current military inventory, yet its professional modifications and obvious quality suggested serious money and expertise behind its creation. Sergeant Rodriguez tells me you're interested in trying our 1-200-yard targets, Patterson said. That's getting into serious long-range territory. Most recreational shooters struggle past 600 yards. I'm not most recreational shooters, Frank replied quietly, without arrogance but with complete confidence. Patterson studied the old man's face, noting the calm assurance in his eyes. What's your background, Mr. Morrison? That's not casual hobby shooting we just witnessed. Frank considered how much to reveal. I did some specialized work for the government years ago. Different time, different world. It wasn't much information, but Patterson caught the careful phrasing. Specialized work could mean many things, but combined with Frank's obvious skills, it suggested military or intelligence background at a very high level. Well, Patterson said, making a decision, let's see what you and that blue rifle can do at 1-200 yards. The crowd of watching Rangers grew larger as Frank moved to a shooting position with a clear line of sight to the distant targets. At 1-200 yards, even large targets appeared as small dots through standard optics. Environmental factors became critical. Wind speed, humidity, temperature, and even the rotation of the earth could affect bullet trajectory. Frank spent considerably more time preparing for this shot than he had for the 800-yard work. He pulled out a small electronic device to measure wind speed and direction at his position, though he knew conditions could be different at various points along the bullet's path. He checked his rifle's zero carefully and made several adjustments to his scope. "This is taking forever," complained Private Johnson. "At this rate, we'll be here all day." Sergeant Rodriguez, who was beginning to understand the complexity of extreme long-range shooting, shushed his student. "Watch and learn, Johnson. This isn't spray and pray. At these distances, everything matters." Frank's preparation included consulting a ballistic calculator on his smartphone, entering atmospheric data and checking his custom ammunition's predicted performance. The watching Rangers were impressed despite themselves. This level of technical sophistication was beyond what most of them had seen, even in military sniper schools. Finally satisfied with his calculations, Frank settled into his shooting position. The 1-200-yard target seemed impossibly small through his scope, a distant mark that challenged the limits of visual identification. Frank's breathing slowed to an almost meditative rhythm as he waited for ideal conditions. The first shot cracked across the range with authority. Downrange, spotters with high-powered scopes called out the impact point. "Hit center ring," came the report over the radio. Frank had placed his bullet within inches of perfect center at a distance where many experienced shooters would struggle to hit the target at all. Impressed murmurs rippled through the crowd of watchers. Several Rangers pulled out their own binoculars and spotting scopes to confirm the impossible shot. Frank chambered another round and fired again. "Hit same location," reported the spotter. The second bullet had joined the first in the target's center ring, creating a group that defied the limitations most people associated with such extreme distances. Major Patterson found himself genuinely amazed. In his 20 years of military service, he had seen exceptional marksmanship, but this level of precision at 1-200 yards was rare even among elite military snipers using the most modern equipment. "Mr. Morrison," Patterson said, "that's extraordinary shooting. Would you mind if I took a look at your rifle? I'm curious about the modifications you've made." Frank nodded and set the weapon down carefully. Patterson examined the blue rifle with the expertise of someone who understood precision firearms. The barrel was clearly custom-made, probably by one of the premier riflesmiths in the country. The action had been blueprinted and modified to tolerances that exceeded military specifications. The stock was a custom carbon fiber design that balanced weight savings with stability. "This isn't just modified," Patterson said admiringly. "This is completely custom-built. What did something like this cost?" "Time and patience," Frank replied diplomatically. "Built it myself over several years." Patterson's respect increased further. Building a precision rifle to this level required machining skills, ballistic knowledge, and understanding of materials science that took decades to develop. Frank wasn't just a good shot. He was a complete firearms expert. Corporal Stevens approached with obvious curiosity. "Mr. Morrison, what's the farthest shot you've ever made with that rifle?" Frank considered the question carefully. He could have mentioned shots made during classified operations, targets engaged at distances that would seem impossible to civilian shooters. Instead, he chose a more diplomatic answer. "Depends on how you define a successful shot," he said. Hitting a target is different from hitting what you're aiming at when it matters. The cryptic response suggested experience beyond recreational shooting. Several of the Rangers exchanged meaningful looks, beginning to suspect that Frank's background might be far more interesting than he was revealing. Private Martinez, who had been studying Frank's shooting technique, asked, "Sir, your breathing control is incredible. Where did you learn that level of technique?" "Good instructors, lots of practice," Frank answered. "Same as anything else worth doing well." Rodriguez stepped forward with growing respect. "Mr. Morrison, would you be willing to share some techniques with my students? What you're demonstrating goes beyond standard military training." Frank looked around at the faces of the young Rangers. He saw genuine interest and respect where there had been skepticism and amusement just hours before. These were good soldiers who were open to learning regardless of where knowledge came from. "I might be able to share a few things," Frank said quietly. "But first, let's see how far your range actually extends. Those 200-yard targets are just getting warmed up." Major Patterson felt a chill of anticipation. If Frank Morrison was just getting warmed up at 200 yards, where was this demonstration heading? Major Patterson found himself in an unusual position. In his 20 years of military service, he had never encountered a civilian who demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his own understanding of what was possible. Frank Morrison's performance at 200 yards had been impressive enough, but his casual suggestion that they were just getting warmed up implied abilities that challenged conventional wisdom about long-range shooting. "Mr. Morrison," Patterson said carefully, "our range officially extends to 2,500 yards, but we have clear sight lines and safety clearance out to about 2,000 yards. However, at those distances, we're talking about shots that most military snipers would consider extremely challenging. Even with perfect conditions," Frank nodded thoughtfully, scanning the distant terrain beyond the established target areas. His experienced eyes evaluated wind patterns, terrain features, and atmospheric conditions with the automatic assessment of someone who had made such calculations thousands of times before. "What kind of targets do you have available at those distances?" Frank asked. Patterson hesitated. "Well, we have some large steel plates that we occasionally use for demonstration purposes. They're about 4 feet square, big enough that you can see hits but small enough to require genuine precision." The gathered Rangers listened to this conversation with growing amazement. These men were among America's elite soldiers, trained to engage targets at distances that challenged human capability. Yet here was a civilian, probably older than some of their fathers, discussing 2,000-yard shots as casually as others might discuss a weekend golf game. Sergeant Rodriguez, whose respect for Frank had grown steadily throughout the morning, stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect, 2,000 yards is nearly impossible. Even our best military snipers rarely attempt shots beyond 1,500 yards in combat situations." Frank turned to look at the young sergeant with patient understanding. "You're absolutely right," he said. "For most people, 2,000 yards is beyond practical capability. But sometimes practical capability isn't enough." The cryptic response suggested experience that went far beyond civilian recreational shooting. Several of the Rangers exchanged glances, beginning to wonder exactly what kind of specialized government work Frank had mentioned earlier. Major Patterson made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Mr. Morrison, if you're serious about attempting a 2,000-yard shot, I'll authorize the use of our extended range. But I have to ask, what makes you think such a shot is even possible?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant hills beyond the range. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories that stretched back decades. "I've made longer shots when they mattered," he said simply. "Today this is just practice." The casual admission sent a ripple of shock through the watching soldiers. Longer shots than 2,000 yards? In combat situations? Suddenly, Frank Morrison wasn't just an impressive old man with a custom rifle. He was potentially someone whose background included operations that were far beyond normal military experience. Patterson ordered range personnel to set up the large steel target at 2,000 yards. This required driving a vehicle to the distant location, a journey that took nearly 10 minutes. As they waited, Frank continued his methodical preparation, checking and rechecking equipment with the patience of someone who understood that at extreme distances, small errors became massive failures. Private Johnson, who had been among the most skeptical observers earlier, approached Frank hesitantly. "Sir, can I ask you something?" That comment about making longer shots when they mattered, were you military? Frank looked at the young soldier thoughtfully. I served my country for many years, he said carefully. Different kind of service than what you're doing, but service nonetheless. The vague answer raised more questions than it answered, but Frank's tone made it clear that certain details would remain private. Johnson nodded respectfully and stepped back, understanding that some stories weren't meant to be shared. When the target was finally in position, Frank began his most extensive preparation yet. The 2,000-yard shot would require calculating for numerous environmental factors that barely mattered at shorter distances. Wind speed and direction could vary significantly between his position and the target. Temperature differences would affect air density and bullet performance. Even the curvature of the Earth became a factor at such extreme ranges. Frank pulled out a small laptop computer and began entering data into what appeared to be a sophisticated ballistic calculation program. The watching Rangers were amazed by the level of technology and preparation involved in extreme long-range shooting. I've never seen anything like this, whispered Corporal Stevens to his squadmate. This guy isn't just shooting, he's conducting a scientific experiment. Frank's preparation took nearly 30 minutes. He measured atmospheric conditions multiple times, calculated different scenarios based on varying wind patterns, and even consulted topographical data about the terrain between his position and the target. The blue rifle received careful inspection, with Frank checking every component that could affect accuracy. Finally satisfied with his preparations, Frank assumed his shooting position. The 2,000-yard target was barely visible even through his high-powered scope, appearing as a small square that shimmered in the heat waves rising from the distant ground. The crowd of watchers had grown to include nearly everyone on the range. Word had spread about the old man's incredible shooting, and personnel from other areas of the base had arrived to witness what was becoming a legendary demonstration. Frank's breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that all precision shooters must master. At 2,000 yards, the bullet would take several seconds to reach the target, traveling in a high arc that carried it hundreds of feet above the ground at its peak. Environmental factors would push and pull at the projectile throughout its long journey. The shot, when it came, seemed to hang in the air forever. The blue rifle's report echoed across the range, but the distant target showed no immediate indication of impact. For long seconds, everyone waited in suspense. Then the radio crackled with the spotter's report. Hit, center of target. The range erupted in amazement. Frank Morrison had just accomplished something that most people would consider impossible. A precise hit at 2,000 yards using equipment that appeared decades old. The implications of such shooting ability were staggering. Major Patterson stared at Frank with new understanding. This wasn't just exceptional marksmanship. This was capability that suggested involvement in operations that existed at the very edge of military possibility. But Frank Morrison wasn't finished yet. As he chambered another round, he looked at the assembled crowd of amazed soldiers and smiled slightly. That was the warm-up, he said quietly. Now let's see what this old rifle can really do. The successful 2,000-yard shot had created a buzz of excitement that spread throughout the entire military base. Word traveled quickly in military communities, and soon vehicles were arriving at the range carrying personnel from various units who had heard rumors about an extraordinary shooting demonstration. Major Patterson found himself in unprecedented territory. As range commander, he was responsible for safety and proper procedures. But Frank Morrison's capabilities were forcing him to consider possibilities that existed far beyond normal operational parameters. Mr. Morrison, Patterson said, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and concern. When you said that 2,000 yards was just warm-up, what exactly did you have in mind? Frank was studying the terrain beyond the established range boundaries through a pair of high-powered binoculars. His weathered face showed the concentration of someone making complex calculations while evaluating multiple variables simultaneously. There's a ridge line about 4,500 yards out, Frank said, lowering the binoculars. Good backdrop, clear sight lines, and enough elevation difference to make the ballistics interesting. The casual mention of a 4,500-yard shot created stunned silence among the listening soldiers. That distance was nearly 3 miles, a range where atmospheric conditions, Earth rotation, and gravitational effects all became significant factors in bullet trajectory. Sergeant Rodriguez, whose respect for Frank had grown throughout the day, stepped forward with obvious concern. Sir, 4,500 yards isn't just difficult. It's theoretically beyond the effective range of any small arms weapon. Even military sniper rifles aren't designed for such distances. Frank turned to look at the young sergeant with patient understanding. You're thinking about this from the perspective of standard military equipment and conventional tactics, he said. But some situations require unconventional solutions. The cryptic response suggested experience with operations that existed far outside normal military parameters. Patterson found himself wondering exactly what kind of classified work Frank's background might include. Lieutenant Colonel Davies, the base operations commander, arrived with his staff after hearing reports about the unusual demonstration. A veteran of special operations, Davies had extensive experience with unconventional warfare and unique capabilities, but even his background didn't prepare him for what he was witnessing. Major Patterson, Davies said, I understand we have a civilian on the range demonstrating some unusual shooting abilities. Yes, sir, Patterson replied. Mr. Morrison has just completed successful engagements at 800, 1,200, and 2,000 yards with precision. That exceeds anything I've seen in 20 years of service, Davies studied Frank. With the assessment skills of someone trained to evaluate human capabilities quickly and accurately, Frank's calm demeanor, professional equipment handling, and obvious technical expertise suggested background that went far beyond civilian recreational shooting. Mr. Morrison, Davies said, extending his hand, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Davies. I understand you're considering attempting a shot at 4,500 yards? Frank shook the offered hand firmly. Considering it, yes. Whether it's practical depends on several factors I'm still evaluating. Davies found Frank's measured response intriguing. Most people attempting extraordinary feats showed excitement, nervousness, or bravado. Frank displayed the calm professionalism of someone who approached extreme challenges as routine problem-solving exercises. What factors are you evaluating? Davies asked. Frank gestured toward the distant ridgeline. Wind patterns change significantly over that distance. I'm tracking 3 different wind zones between here and the target area. Temperature gradients will affect air density throughout the bullet's flight path, and at 4,500 yards, Earth rotation becomes a factor that requires compensation. The technical sophistication of Frank's analysis impressed the gathered officers. This level of ballistic calculation was typically associated with artillery fire control systems, not individual small arms shooting. Private Martinez, who had been following the demonstration since early morning, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Sir, has anyone ever made a successful shot at that distance before? Frank considered the question carefully. There are records of successful engagements at similar distances, he said diplomatically. But most of those records are classified and involve circumstances that aren't publicly discussed. The implication was clear to the experienced military personnel present. Frank was suggesting knowledge of classified operations that involved precision shooting at distances that challenged the limits of what was technically possible. Colonel, Davies made a decision that surprised everyone. Mr. Morrison, if you believe such a shot is feasible, I'll authorize whatever range support you need. But I have to ask, what's your background that gives you confidence in attempting something that most experts would consider impossible? Frank was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of memory spanning decades. I spent 30 years doing work that required solutions when conventional approaches weren't sufficient, he said. Sometimes that meant engaging targets that others considered beyond reach. The carefully worded response told Davies everything he needed to know. Frank Morrison was almost certainly a veteran of special operations programs that operated at the very edge of technical possibility. His equipment, skills, and calm approach to extreme challenges suggested involvement in classified programs that pushed the boundaries of human capability. Very well, Davies said. What do you need? Frank's requirements were extensive and technically sophisticated. He needed detailed meteorological data for the entire flight path of his bullet. He required survey-grade measurements of elevation differences and exact distance calculations. Most importantly, he needed spotters positioned at intermediate points to track the bullet's path and provide real-time feedback about environmental conditions. The base's meteorological section was contacted to provide detailed atmospheric data. Survey teams were dispatched to establish precise measurements of the intended target area. Communications personnel set up relay stations to coordinate between multiple observation points. As preparations continued, Frank worked on his rifle with the focused attention of a craftsman, preparing his most important tool. He made minute adjustments to his scope, checked every component of his ammunition, and even cleaned parts of the rifle that appeared spotless to outside observers. "This is incredible," whispered Captain Thompson to his aide. "We're watching someone prepare for a shot that could rewrite the record books." Word had spread throughout the base and beyond. Military personnel from neighboring installations were arriving to witness what was becoming a legendary demonstration. Even civilian experts in ballistics and precision shooting had somehow learned about the event and were requesting permission to observe. Frank's preparation took over 2 hours. The complexity of calculating bullet trajectory at 4,500 yards required sophisticated computer modeling, environmental monitoring, and equipment adjustments that challenged the limits of civilian shooting sports. Finally, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the range, Frank announced that he was ready to attempt the impossible shot. The gathered crowd had grown to nearly 200 people, all waiting to witness something that might never be attempted again. Frank settled into a shooting position with the calm confidence of someone who had faced impossible challenges before. Through his scope, the target area was barely visible, a distant point that seemed to shimmer in the heat waves of late afternoon. The shot that was about to be attempted would either establish Frank Morrison as one of the most capable marksmen in history, or it would demonstrate that even exceptional skills had practical limits that couldn't be overcome by preparation and determination alone. The atmosphere at the range had transformed from casual curiosity to intense anticipation. Nearly 200 military personnel and civilian experts had gathered to witness what could potentially be the longest precision rifle shot ever attempted. Frank Morrison, the unassuming elderly man who had arrived that morning in a dusty pickup truck, was now the center of attention for what had become an unprecedented demonstration. Frank settled into his final shooting position with deliberate care. The custom blue rifle felt familiar in his hands, but he knew that at 4,500 yards, even the slightest imperfection in technique would result in a complete miss. The margin for error at such extreme distances was measured in fractions of degrees and milliseconds of timing. Through his high-powered scope, the target area appeared as little more than a shimmering point in the distance. Frank had chosen a distinctive rock formation on the ridgeline, a natural feature that would provide clear visual confirmation of bullet impact. Even with his sophisticated optics, the target seemed impossibly small and distant. The meteorological data painted a complex picture of atmospheric conditions along the bullet's flight path. Wind patterns varied significantly at different elevations, creating multiple zones where environmental factors would influence trajectory. Temperature gradients would affect air density, altering the bullet's speed and path. Throughout its 3-mile journey, Lieutenant Colonel Davies positioned himself where he could observe both Frank's shooting position and communicate with spotters stationed at intermediate points along the intended bullet path. The level of coordination required for this shot rivaled that of artillery fire missions, requiring precise timing and communication between multiple observation posts. "Wind data updated," reported the meteorological technician over the radio. Surface winds 3 to 5 miles per hour from the southwest. Mid-level winds 8 to 12 miles per hour from the west. Upper-level patterns showing gusts to 15 miles per hour. Variable direction. Frank absorbed this information while making final adjustments to his scope. At 4,500 yards, wind compensation would require him to aim several feet away from his intended point of impact, trusting complex calculations to guide his bullet through the shifting atmospheric conditions. Major Patterson, standing nearby with a range of emotions from excitement to professional concern, watched Frank's preparation with growing amazement. "Mr. Morrison, in all honesty, what do you estimate your chances of success at this distance?" Frank paused in his adjustments to consider the question seriously. "Under ideal conditions, with perfect equipment and flawless execution, maybe 1 shot in 10, he said. "Today's conditions aren't ideal, but they're workable." The honest assessment sent a ripple of understanding through the gathered observers. Even Frank, with all his obvious expertise and sophisticated equipment, considered this an extremely challenging attempt with limited probability of success. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become one of Frank's most vocal supporters throughout the day, stepped forward with obvious concern. "Sir, given those odds, are you sure you want to attempt this? Your reputation is already established after the shooting we've witnessed today." Frank looked at the young sergeant with appreciation for his concern. "Rodriguez, reputation isn't why I'm here. Sometimes you attempt difficult things not because success is guaranteed, but because the attempt itself teaches you something valuable." The philosophical response revealed another dimension of Frank's character. This wasn't about showmanship or proving superiority. For Frank, extreme long-range shooting was an ongoing exploration of the boundaries between human capability, technological precision, and environmental factors. Frank's final preparations included a detailed review of his ballistic calculations on his laptop computer. The custom software he used incorporated dozens of variables that affected bullet trajectory at extreme distances: Earth rotation, gravitational effects, atmospheric pressure variations, and even the slight differences in elevation along the bullet's path, all factored into his firing solution. "Spotters report ready," Davies announced over the radio. Observation teams positioned at 2,500, 3,000, and 4,200 yards would track the bullet's progress and provide real-time feedback about its path toward the distant target. Frank chambered a single round, his movements deliberate and controlled. The custom ammunition represented years of load development, testing different powder charges, bullet weights, and case preparations to achieve optimal performance. Each cartridge was handcrafted to tolerances that exceeded factory ammunition by significant margins. The crowd fell completely silent as Frank assumed his final shooting position. His breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that all precision shooters must master, but at 4,500 yards, timing became even more critical. The bullet would be in flight for over 6 seconds, requiring Frank to account for changes in atmospheric conditions that might occur during that time. Through his scope, Frank could barely distinguish the target rock formation. The heat shimmer from afternoon warming created visual distortions that challenged his ability to maintain precise aim. He waited patiently for moments when atmospheric conditions provided the clearest possible view of his intended impact. Point Frank's finger found the trigger with the gentle pressure that marked decades of training. At extreme distances, trigger control became even more critical than normal. Any jerking motion or inconsistent pressure would send the bullet far from its intended path. The shot came as a surprise even to Frank, the mark of perfect trigger technique. The blue rifle's report echoed across the range with authority, but the real drama was just beginning. The bullet would travel for over 6 seconds before reaching its destination, a journey that would test every aspect of Frank's calculations and preparation. "Shot away," reported the first spotter at 2,500 yards, tracking supersonic signature. The bullet was traveling at over 2,800 feet per second, but atmospheric drag would slow it significantly during its long journey. By the time it reached the target area, velocity would have dropped to barely half its initial speed, creating additional complications for trajectory prediction. "Passing second checkpoint," reported the 3,000-yard spotter. "Trajectory appears nominal." Frank remained in position, his scope still focused on the distant target area. At 4,500 yards, he wouldn't be able to see bullet impact directly, but he might detect the dust cloud or rock fragments that would result from a successful hit. "Passing final checkpoint," reported the 4,200-yard spotter. 3 seconds to impact. The entire range held its breath as they waited for confirmation from the target area. 6 seconds had passed since Frank fired, but it felt like an eternity to the hundreds of people watching this unprecedented attempt. Then, through the shimmering heat waves of late afternoon, a small dust cloud appeared near the target rock formation. "Hit," shouted the final spotter. "Confirmed impact on target." The range erupted in cheers and amazement. Frank Morrison had just accomplished something that most experts would have considered impossible. A precision rifle shot at 4,500 yards, nearly 3 miles, using equipment that appeared decades old and techniques that challenged conventional understanding of long-range shooting capabilities. But Frank wasn't finished yet. As the celebration continued around him, he calmly chambered another round and returned to his shooting position. "Mr. Morrison," Davies asked in amazement, "what are you doing?" Frank looked up from his scope with a slight smile. "Making sure it wasn't just luck," he said quietly. The second shot would prove whether Frank Morrison was simply an extraordinary marksman or something beyond normal human capability entirely. The second shot at 4,500 yards created even more tension than the first. Everyone present understood that one successful hit at such an extreme distance might be explained by exceptional luck combined with skill. 2 consecutive hits would prove that Frank Morrison possessed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Frank's preparation for the second shot was more efficient than the first. He had already established his environmental calculations and equipment settings. Minor adjustments accounted for slight changes in atmospheric conditions, but the fundamental firing solution remained valid. The crowd of observers had grown beyond anything Major Patterson had ever witnessed on a military range. Word had spread through military communications networks, and personnel from multiple bases were arriving to witness what was becoming a legendary demonstration of marksmanship. Frank settled into his shooting position. With the same calm precision he had displayed throughout the day, the blue rifle felt comfortable in his hands. An extension of his will and expertise developed over decades of practice and real-world application. "Wind-up date," reported the meteorological technician. Surface conditions remained stable. Mid-level patterns showing slight increase in velocity, but consistent direction. Frank made microscopic adjustments to his scope, compensating for the changing conditions. At 4,500 yards, even small environmental changes could affect bullet trajectory by several feet, turning a potential hit into a complete miss. The second shot followed the same ritual as the first. Frank's breathing controlled, his finger pressure consistent. His mind focused entirely on the complex task of sending a small projectile accurately across nearly 3 miles of varying atmospheric conditions. The blue rifle's report echoed across the range again. 6 seconds of flight time began, with spotters tracking the bullet's progress through multiple checkpoints. The tension was unbearable as hundreds of people waited to learn whether Frank Morrison was truly capable of repeating his impossible achievement. "Hit confirmed," came the final report. Second impact within 2 feet of the first. The celebration that followed was unlike anything seen on a military range. Hardened combat veterans, experienced marksmen, and ballistics experts cheered with genuine amazement at witnessing something they had never believed possible. Lieutenant Colonel Davies approached Frank with obvious respect and intense curiosity. "Mr. Morrison, what you've just accomplished challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of precision shooting. I have to ask directly, what is your background?" Frank finished safing his rifle and looked around at the faces of the amazed soldiers. These were good people who deserved honest answers, at least to the extent that he could provide them. "My name is Frank Morrison," he began, his voice carrying the weight of memories that stretched back decades. "I served in the United States military for 32 years, most of that time in units that don't officially exist. My specialty was precision engagement at distances that conventional doctrine considered impossible." The admission created stunned silence. Davies, whose security clearance gave him knowledge of special operations programs, began to understand the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Developed this rifle and ammunition combination during the 1990s for operations in Afghanistan and other locations where extreme long-range capability was necessary. The blue coating isn't just aesthetic, it's a specialized finish developed by aerospace engineers to reduce thermal signature and provide superior environmental protection. Frank continued his explanation, revealing details that painted a picture of operations conducted at the very edge of technical possibility. "The longest shot I made in operational circumstances was 700 meters, over 5 miles. That was in 2003 in Afghanistan, engaging a high-value target that conventional forces couldn't reach through normal means." The mention of an 8,700-meter shot created gasps of disbelief. That distance was beyond what most people considered possible with any small arms weapon. Entering territory typically associated with artillery systems, Major Patterson, whose respect for Frank had grown throughout the day, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, why are you here today? Why demonstrate these capabilities on a training range?" Frank's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to explain his motivations. "I'm 73 years old," he said simply. "The skills I developed over 3 decades of service will die with me unless I pass them on to the next generation. These young Rangers represent America's future special operations capability. They deserve to know what's possible when conventional limits aren't sufficient." Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward with obvious emotion. Sir, everything we witnessed today, this was you teaching us. Partly, Frank acknowledged. But mostly it was me hoping to inspire you to push beyond what you think is possible. The enemies you'll face in the future won't respect conventional limitations. Sometimes you'll need solutions that exist beyond normal doctrine. Davies understood the implications immediately. Frank Morrison represented institutional knowledge from classified programs that operated at the very edge of human capability. His willingness to share that knowledge, even in limited form, was an extraordinary gift to current military personnel. Mr. Morrison, Davies said formally, would you be willing to work with our advanced marksmanship programs? What you've demonstrated today could revolutionize our approach to long-range precision shooting. Frank considered the offer carefully. I'm retired, Colonel. Have been for 10 years. But these Rangers are good soldiers who deserve the best training available. I might be able to share some techniques, help develop better equipment, maybe push the boundaries of what your students think is achievable. The offer was accepted immediately. Within weeks, Frank Morrison became an unofficial consultant to several special operations training programs. His techniques, equipment modifications, and tactical applications of extreme long-range shooting became part of advanced curriculum for America's most elite soldiers. The blue rifle, that had seemed so unusual that morning, became the prototype for a new generation of precision weapons. Frank's custom ammunition designs were analyzed and improved by military researchers. His ballistic calculation methods were incorporated into sophisticated fire control systems. But perhaps most importantly, Frank's demonstration of seemingly impossible capabilities inspired a generation of young soldiers to push beyond conventional limitations. The Rangers who witnessed his shooting that day carried forward the understanding that human potential, when combined with proper preparation and superior equipment, could achieve things that others considered impossible. Years later, when these same Rangers faced combat situations that required unconventional solutions, they remembered the old man with the blue rifle who had taught them that impossible was often just another word for untried. Frank Morrison returned to his quiet retirement, but his legacy lived on in the enhanced capabilities of America's Special Operations Forces. The techniques he shared and the inspiration he provided continued to influence military precision shooting. Long after his demonstration at the range had become the stuff of legend, the blue rifle was eventually donated to the Special Operations Museum, where it stands as a testament to human ingenuity, dedication, and the refusal to accept conventional limitations when extraordinary circumstances demand extraordinary solutions. Frank's 700-meter shot remained classified, but the men and women who learned from his teaching carried forward the knowledge that such achievements were possible for those willing to dedicate themselves to the pursuit of excellence beyond normal boundaries.